The name of my project is Company ESG by Tyler Sullivan. The topic of this project is environmental impact data. I chose to research the impact that companies have on the environment. I wanted to study how businesses affect the environment. Topic: the amount of pollution caused by companies. The industries and businesses have the most impact on the environment. This will show the outcome to analyze environmental impact. Word guide. These words are represented in the data and are important to the data. Working capacity, human health effects, climate change, air pollution, and toxicity. Fish production capacity. This means acidification, eutrophication, climate change, and toxicity. Crop production capacity. Soil. This means soil degradation, air pollution, climate change, and land use. Meat production means soil degradation, climate change, land use. Biodiversity means the land use and toxicity. Abiotic resources means environmental impacts from mining. Water production means climate change, land use, water pollution. Wood production means climate change, air pollution, and land use. I will use Tableau to refine the data. I took the data from Kaggle. I will edit the data so the numerical data makes sense. The numerical data will be represented with graphs and charts. I will simplify it and detail it to make sure the explanation makes sense. Secondary source. The secondary source that I will be using is Kaggle.com. The title of the data is Corporate Environmental Impact. The non-numerical data are fields listed as columns. Non-numerical data lists company information and the company location, the name of the company, and the year the company was created. Numerical data represents fields listed as columns. Numerical data describes environment impact, percentage and actual numbers, industries, and environment impact. The data analysis represents non-numerical data. The non-numerical data represents the company names. It also represents the country names and the industries the companies are in. The numerical data represents the percentage of impact on the environment. The numerical data also represents numerical production of certain environment pollutants. Biodiversity is represented in this bar graph. Biodiversity represents land use and toxicity. Abiotic resources is represented in this bar graph. Abiotic resources represent environment impacts. Fish production bar graph represents the companies and the fish production capacity of the companies. Biodiversity represents land use and toxicity. This represents the land use and toxicity of each country that is represented with each bar graph in this data. The environmental cost of this is represented for each business is represented in this data for the United States. Wood production is represented in this data for each business that is represented in the United States for these businesses in this data. Word production capacity represents the climate change, air pollution, and land use. Total environment intensity is represented in this bar graph, and also the total environmental cost is represented in this data for the businesses in the United States. Crop production capacity is represented in this bar graph for each country. Crop production represents soil degradation, air pollution, and climate change. Industry data is represented in this by the wood production capacity for each industry. Each industry is represented in this data set, and this represents climate change, air pollution, and land use. The industry data is also represented in this data, and the wood production is climate change, air pollution, and land use. The United States is represented in this data, and the industries that are involved in the United States. The water production of each industry is represented in this, and the water production is climate change. Climate change is also represented in this for each country. Spain is the highest, United States is the second highest, and India is the third highest. The total environmental cost of each country is represented in this data set, with the United States being the highest. Water production is represented in this data set. The water production capacity is represented in this, and it represents climate change of each business within the United States. Water production is represented in this. The United States represents the businesses that are represented in this are in the United States, and this represents climate change. The climate change is also represented here, and the differences in each business across the United States. There are a couple of businesses that are represented here, and you can see the difference in climate change. Biodiversity is represented here for each country that is listed, and biodiversity means the land use and toxicity and how this is represented in the environment. Industry data is also represented here. Water production and working capacity. Production of electricity is the highest industry here of water production capacity and working capacity. This is climate change, air pollution, and land use. United States data is represented here in fish production capacity and meat production capacity. Fish production capacity is represented here. This represents fish production capacity. Environmental cost is represented here for each country. Crop production capacity is represented here, and this represents soil degradation, air pollution, and climate change. The industry that is highest is manufacturer of rubber. The second highest is manufacture of basic iron. Environmental cost is also displayed in this data set. The country that is highest with environmental costs is India. Industry data is represented here for the working capacity and water production capacity. United States fish production data is represented here. The country data is represented here for the biodiversity. Biodiversity represents land use and toxicity. Sweden has the highest land use and toxicity of every country that is represented. Environment values. The environment values that are represented here represent 3,562. Total environment values also represent 13,176. Working capacity also represents 13,169 unique values. Companies and countries. The number of company names that are represented are 2,560 in this data set. Countries, 17% are in the United States, 16% are in Japan, and the industries are represented with financial intermediate of 11% and manufacturer of electricity 5%. Listed countries are the United States at 17%, Japan at 6%.